deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where the limestone peaks of Newman's Ridge are perpetually choked by a thick, haunting mist, there are secrets that the wind refuses to carry away. Imagine it is the late 1700s. You are an explorer, pushing through the jagged wilderness of what would become Tennessee, expecting to find nothing but ancient forests and perhaps a few Cherokee hunting parties. But instead, you stumble upon something impossible. High on a ridge that no sensible farmer would ever choose, you see them. Dark-skinned people with chiseled European features and piercing blue eyes. They speak a broken, archaic form of English. They claim to be Portuguese, yet they live like ghosts in the shadows of the American frontier. They are the Melungeons, and for 300 years, their very existence was a crime against the social order of a young nation. Before we descend further into the fog of Newman's Ridge to uncover the truth about this forbidden bloodline, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You are about to enter a world of history that was never meant to be told, and you won't want to miss a single chapter of this unfolding enigma. The story of the Melungeons does not begin with a census or a legal document. It begins with a feeling of profound unease. When the first white settlers of Scotch-Irish descent began to trickle into the valleys of the Appalachians, they believed they were the first pioneers to tame this land. They were wrong. High above them, looking down from the steep, rocky slopes, were families who had already been there for generations. These were people who didn't fit into the neat boxes of the 18th century world. In a land that was rapidly being divided into black and white, slave and free, the Melungeons were an anomaly that the law could not explain. They were people of color, yet they didn't look like the enslaved people brought from West Africa. They had the high cheekbones of the indigenous tribes, yet their eyes were often the color of a winter sky. They lived in cabins, farmed the thin soil, and practiced a rugged form of Christianity, yet they were treated as pariahs. To the outsiders, they were a mystery to be feared. To the law, they were a problem to be solved. The name itself, Melungeon, was whispered like a curse. Some say it comes from the French word mélange, meaning a mixture. Others believe it is rooted in the Arabic term Melungeon, meaning a cursed soul abandoned by God. Regardless of the name, their life was one of forced isolation. Because they could not prove they were purely white, they were stripped of their right to vote, their right to own land, and their right to an education. They were driven off the fertile valley floors and forced onto the inhospitable ridges, where the soil was poor, but the isolation was total. It was here, in the silence of the high peaks, that the Melungeon culture hardened into a fortress of secrecy. They learned that to survive, they had to stay hidden. They learned that their blood was a liability, a secret to be kept from their own children to protect them from the sting of the world's cruelty. But as the mist rolls over the ridge, we have to ask the question that has haunted American genealogy for centuries. Where did they actually come from? If they weren't European, weren't African, and weren't strictly Native American, whose ghosts are they? The legends they told each other by the hearth fire spoke of shipwrecks, of lost colonies, and of ancient Mediterranean sailors who found themselves stranded in a new world long before the Mayflower ever sighted land. They called themselves the Portuguese, a haunting echo of a Portuguese heritage that no one could verify, but no Melungeon would ever deny. As we look at the first recorded encounters in the 1790s, we see the confusion of the early tax collectors. They didn't know how to categorize these people. In some records, they are listed as free persons of color. In others, they are simply marked with an X, a symbol of the unknown. They were a people living in the cracks of history, a forgotten tribe that refused to vanish. The more the outside world tried to push them away, the deeper their roots grew into the rocky soil of Newman's Ridge. They became a community of survivors, bound together by a shared mystery and a shared burden of forbidden blood. This is only the beginning of the journey. The deeper we go into the mountains, the darker the secrets become. To understand the mystery of the Melungeons, we must first look at them through the eyes of those who feared them. Imagine a world of rigid lines, where every person was defined by the color of their skin and the history of their ancestors. In the valleys of the Clinch River and the ridges of Hancock County, the settlers encountered a visual paradox that defied everything they knew about race. They expected to see the pale skin of Europe, the deep mahogany of Africa, or the copper tones of the Cherokee. Instead, they found a people who were a haunting mosaic of all three, yet belonged to none. The physical description of a Melungeon was often written with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Early observers spoke of men and women with skin the color of burnished copper or antique bronze. It wasn't the skin of a person who had spent too much time in the sun. It was a deep, Mediterranean duskiness that seemed to glow from within. But then, you would look at their eyes. Instead of the dark irises you might expect, you would see eyes of a startling electric blue, or a gray so pale it looked like the morning mist. Their hair was another enigma. It was often jet black and as straight as a raven's wing, lacking the curl of the African or the wave of the European. Their features were fine, with narrow noses and high, prominent cheekbones that gave them an air of tragic nobility. In 1784, John Sevier, the first governor of Tennessee, recorded one of the earliest official encounters with these people. He described finding a colony of dark-skinned people who claimed to be Portuguese. They weren't living like savages. They were living in organized communities, farming the land, and speaking a language that sounded like a ghostly echo of the old world. Sevier was confused. He was a man who knew the frontier, yet he couldn't place these people in any category. They weren't his enemies, but the law told him they couldn't be his equals. This encounter set the stage for a century of racial confusion. As the 19th century progressed, the descriptions became more specific and more haunting. Travelers who ventured into the isolation of Newman's Ridge spoke of the blue-eyed Indians. They described the Melungeons as having a physical grace that was out of place in the rugged, harsh environment of the mountains. One of the most famous physical markers, whispered about in local folklore and later studied by doctors, was what became known as the Melungeon bump. This is a small, bony protuberance at the back of the skull, technically called an external occipital protuberance. While it exists in many populations, in the closed community of the Melungeons, it became a secret handshake of biology, a hidden sign of their unique lineage. Then, there were the teeth. Many Melungeons possessed what dentists call shovel-shaped incisors, a trait where the back of the front teeth is scooped out like a shovel. It is a feature common in Native American and East Asian populations, but when combined with their Mediterranean skin and European eyes, it created a biological puzzle that seemed to point in a dozen different directions at once. To the doctors of the time, they were a freak occurrence. To the neighbors, they were the others. The confusion over their appearance led to a strange and often contradictory set of labels. In the census records, a single Melungeon individual might be listed as white in one decade, mulatto in the next, and Indian in the third. It depended entirely on the whim of the census taker and how dark the person looked that day. This visual ambiguity was a weapon used against them. Because they looked foreign, they were often accused of being part of a great African conspiracy or remnants of a lost pirate crew. There is a story of a traveler in the mid-1800s who stopped at a Melungeon cabin for water. He was struck by the beauty of the woman who greeted him. She had the olive skin of a Spaniard, the stature of a tall mountain woman, and eyes that were so light they seemed to pierce right through him. When he asked her where her people came from, she simply pointed to the mountains and said, "We have always been here." This was the Melungeon answer to the world's curiosity. They didn't have a written history to give him. They only had their blood and their bones, which told a story of a journey that had been forgotten by time. By the time the Civil War arrived, the physical identity of the Melungeons had become a matter of survival. In a society that was increasingly obsessed with racial purity, looking different was a death sentence for one's social standing. The Melungeons were often described as Black Dutch or Portuguese by their own families, not necessarily because they knew it to be true, but because it was a safer label than the alternatives. To be Black Dutch was to be a dark-skinned European, which allowed you to keep your land. To be Melungeon was to be a question mark, and in the 19th century South, question marks were not allowed to vote. We must also consider the psychological weight of this identity. Imagine growing up in a home where you are told you are Portuguese, but when you go to town, the children call you names, and the sheriff watches you with suspicion. You look in the mirror and see a face that belongs to the Mediterranean, but you are trapped in the woods of Tennessee. This disconnect between how they looked and how they were treated created a culture of intense privacy. They stopped talking to outsiders. They stopped telling the old stories. The physical traits that made them beautiful also made them targets. Scientists in later years would try to quantify these traits. They would measure the width of their noses, the angle of their jawlines, and the specific shade of their skin. They found markers that suggested a massive, ancient blending of peoples. They saw the remnants of the Berber tribes of North Africa, the Sephardic Jews of Spain, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. But in the 1800s, there was no DNA testing. There was only the eye test, and the Melungeons failed it in every possible way. They were too white to be black, too dark to be white, and too strange to be Indian. The tragedy of the Melungeon identity is that their physical beauty was the very thing that led to their social exile. They were a living, breathing testament to a history of global travel and mingling that the official history books wanted to ignore. Every blue-eyed child born to a dark-skinned mother on Newman's Ridge was a challenge to the narrative of a pure America. They were the people in between, the ghosts of the frontier, whose faces held the map of a journey we are only now beginning to understand. As we move deeper into their history, we will see that their appearance was just the surface of a much deeper, much more dangerous secret. Stay tuned as we prepare to cross the threshold into the most controversial theory of all. If they weren't who the census said they were, could they be the survivors of England's greatest maritime mystery? The answers lie in the shadow of a lost colony, and the truth is more haunting than any fiction. To find the true origin of the Melungeons, we must travel back even further in time, long before the United States was a dream, to a rainy coast in 1587. This is the year of the lost colony of Roanoke. Over 100 English men, women, and children were left on an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Their leader, John White, sailed back to England for supplies, But when he finally returned 3 years later, the settlement was a ghost town. The houses were gone. The people had vanished. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. For centuries, historians have asked where they went. Did they starve? Were they killed? Or did they do the only thing possible for survival? Did they move inland and disappear into the bloodlines of the people already living there? This is where the mystery of Roanoke crashes into the mystery of the Melungeons like a storm tide. For generations, a persistent theory has whispered that the Melungeons are the direct descendants of those lost English settlers. It suggests that the people John White left behind didn't die, but instead migrated deep into the heart of the continent, eventually finding sanctuary in the impenetrable folds of the Appalachian Mountains. If you look at the early records of the Melungeons, the evidence is hauntingly specific. When the first pioneers reached the mountains of East Tennessee, they were shocked to find dark-skinned people who bore the surnames of the Roanoke settlers. Names like Dare, Cooper, and Sampson appeared among the mountain families. Could it be a coincidence? Or were these the echoes of a lost English heritage preserved in the isolation of the ridges? The theory posits that the Roanoke survivors merged with friendly Native American tribes, perhaps the Croatan or the Lumbee, and as they moved further west to escape the encroaching tide of new European settlement, they became the people we now call Melungeons. But this wasn't just a simple migration. It was a transformation. To survive in the wilderness, these English families would have had to shed their European identities. They would have married into the tribes, learned the secrets of the land, and watched as their skin darkened under the mountain sun, and their lineage became a tapestry of many worlds. By the time they were discovered again in the late 18th century, they had forgotten the specific details of Roanoke, but they kept a vague, persistent memory of being the first. They knew they weren't like the newcomers. They were the original pioneers who had been swallowed by the forest and spat back out as something entirely new. Consider the tragedy of this connection. If the Melungeons truly are the descendants of Roanoke, it means they were the first English children born in the New World, only to be abandoned by their mother country and then persecuted by their own distant cousins centuries later. The very people who should have been celebrated as the ultimate American survivors were instead labeled as outcasts and tri-racial isolates. They were the living bridge between the old world and the new, yet they were treated as a gap in history that needed to be closed. Critics of the lost colony theory argue that the geography doesn't match, that the distance from the coast of North Carolina to the mountains of Tennessee is too great for a group of Elizabethan settlers to traverse. But the wilderness of the 16th century was not a wall. It was a highway for those who knew how to walk it. The indigenous trade routes stretched for thousands of miles. If the Roanoke settlers joined a tribe, they would have moved as the tribe moved. They would have sought the high ground, the places where they could see an enemy coming from miles away. The limestone fortresses of Newman's Ridge would have been the perfect final destination for a people who simply wanted to be left alone. There is a psychological resonance to this theory that many Melungeons feel in their bones. It explains the Englishness of their early language, the archaic phrases and the King James style of speech that early observers noted. It explains why they insisted they were Portuguese to avoid being classified as black while still clinging to European customs. Perhaps Portuguese was a safer, more exotic mask to wear than the lost English. In a world where being a mongrel was a legal death sentence, having a mysterious, faraway origin was a shield. Imagine the first generation of these blended families. They would have sat around fires in the Blue Ridge Mountains, telling stories of a great water and a wooden fort and a father who never came back from the sea. Over time, those stories would blur. The details of Roanoke would fade into the mist, replaced by the daily struggle of mountain life. The names would stay, but the history would become a ghost. By the time the tax collectors and the census takers arrived in the 1800s, the Melungeons were no longer English, and they were no longer purely indigenous. They were something the world had never seen before, the first true Americans, born of a collision between empires and the earth itself. As we look at the ruins of the Roanoke colony today, we see empty ground. But if we look at the faces of the Melungeon descendants in the hills of Tennessee and Virginia, we see the missing pieces. We see the blue eyes that John White might have recognized. We see the resilience that allowed 100 people to survive in a hostile wilderness. The lost colony wasn't lost. It was hidden. It was hidden in the blood of the people who refused to die, the people who were driven to the highest peaks so they could finally find peace. But even as this theory offers a sense of romantic closure, it doesn't answer everything. It doesn't explain the Mediterranean DNA. It doesn't explain the Turkish rugs found in mountain cabins or the strange, non-English words that still pepper the local dialect. The lost colony might be one thread in the Melungeon tapestry, but the weave is much more complex and much more global than we ever dared to imagine. What if the journey didn't start in England at all? What if it started on the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean, with a group of people who were never supposed to reach the Americas? The further we climb up Newman's Ridge, the more the English ghosts fade and new, darker shadows begin to emerge. Shadows that point across the Atlantic, toward the ancient world of the Moors and the hidden history of the Spanish Inquisition. The blood of the Melungeons is calling from across the sea, and the next chapter of their story will take us into a world of shipwrecks, secret identities, and a journey that defies all logic. Long before the iron-toed boots of English settlers marched across the Appalachian Trail, the shores of the New World were haunted by the ghosts of a different empire. Close your eyes and listen to the sound of the Atlantic in the 16th century. It is a violent, churning graveyard of oak and sail. This was the era of the Portuguese explorers, the master navigators of the known world, whose ships carved paths through uncharted waters. But not every ship made it to its destination. The coastline of the Carolinas is jagged and unforgiving, a place where the ocean devours gold and men alike. For centuries, the Melungeons held on to a single, defiant word when asked about their origins. Portuguese. They didn't say they were British. They didn't say they were Cherokee. They insisted, with a strange and desperate fervor, that they were the sons and daughters of Portugal. To the ears of a 19th century judge or a curious neighbor, this sounded like a convenient lie. In a land where having a drop of African blood could strip you of your humanity, claiming a European ancestry from a far-off land like Portugal was a brilliant survival strategy. If you were Portuguese, you were white in the eyes of the law, or at least white enough to keep your land and your freedom. But what if it wasn't a lie? What if the Melungeons were telling the absolute, unvarnished truth? To find the answer, we have to look at the forgotten expeditions of the mid-1500s. We have to look at men like Juan Pardo and the Spanish outposts that were manned by Portuguese soldiers, men who were left behind in the wilderness of the Southeast when the empires of Europe decided the interior of America was too hostile to conquer. Records from the 1560s tell us of small forts built deep within the Carolinas and Tennessee. These forts were not just military outposts. They were tiny islands of European life in a sea of indigenous power. Many of the soldiers stationed there were Portuguese mercenaries or conscripts. When the forts were eventually abandoned or overrun, these men didn't simply vanish into thin air. They did what survivors always do. They integrated. They took wives from the local tribes. They taught their children the fragments of their language and the symbols of their faith. They passed down the name of their homeland like a sacred relic, a piece of identity that refused to be eroded by the passage of centuries. Imagine a Portuguese sailor, thousands of miles from the sun-drenched streets of Lisbon, standing on a ridge in the Appalachians. He has lost his ship, his country, and his future. All he has left is his name and the color of his skin. As the generations passed, the specific memories of the sea would fade, but the label stayed. We are Portuguese. It became a tribal marker, a way to distinguish themselves from the waves of English and Scotch-Irish settlers who arrived much later. When those later settlers saw these dark-skinned, blue-eyed mountain people, they saw a mystery. But the Melungeons saw themselves as the remnants of an older, more sophisticated world that the forest had claimed as its own. There is a specific kind of melancholy in this theory. It suggests that for hundreds of years, these families were waiting for a home that would never come back for them. They kept the Portuguese identity as a shield against the rising tide of racial laws in America. In the courtrooms of Tennessee and Virginia, the Portuguese defense became a legendary legal loophole. If a Melungeon could convince a jury that their dark skin came from a Mediterranean ancestor rather than an African one, they were allowed to remain free. It was a high-stakes game of ancestral poker, and the Melungeons played it with the grace of people who knew their lives depended on it. But the evidence goes beyond just legal survival. Modern researchers have found cultural echoes that are hard to ignore. In the remote cabins of the Melungeons, observers noted the use of specific weaving patterns and the presence of Mediterranean-style pottery that didn't match anything produced by the English or the local tribes. There were the stories of Turkish or Portuguese coins found in the soil of Newman Ridge, artifacts that suggested a trade network or a heritage that stretched far across the Atlantic. Even the music of the mountains, the haunting strains of what would become bluegrass, carries a minor key sadness that some musicologists believe echoes the fado of Portugal, a music of longing, loss, and the sea. However, the Portuguese claim was a double-edged sword. While it provided a legal defense, it also made the Melungeons targets for intense scrutiny. The more they claimed a foreign, exotic origin, the more the surrounding communities viewed them with suspicion. They were the others in their own land. They were the people who spoke of ships in a place where people only knew the plow. This tension forced them deeper into the mountains, higher up the ridges where the mist could hide their faces and the law couldn't easily follow. They became a secret society of survivors, bound together by the blood of shipwrecked sailors and the silence of the peaks. Think about the physical toll of this history. To be a Melungeon in the 1800s was to live in a state of perpetual defense. You had to remember the story. You had to tell your children, we are not what they say we are. We are from the sea. We are Portuguese. This wasn't just a story told for fun. It was a prayer for safety. It was the only thing standing between a family and the slave markets or the forced labor camps. The fact that they maintained this identity for so long across so many generations suggests that it wasn't just a convenient story. It was a core truth that had been forged in the fires of survival. Yet, as we look closer at the DNA results that have emerged in the 21st century, we find that the Portuguese story is only one piece of a much larger and more terrifying puzzle. While there are indeed Mediterranean markers in the Melungeon blood, there are also traces of something much older and much more controversial. Something that points not just to Portugal, but to the forbidden lands of the Ottoman Empire and the secret voyages of the Moors. The Portuguese survivors may have been the ones who gave the Melungeons their name, but they weren't the only ones hiding in the mountains. The Portuguese label was a mask, a beautiful, necessary mask, but behind that mask lies a history of global migration that would shatter our understanding of how America was settled. As we move into the next chapter of this mystery, we must leave the coast and the shipwrecks behind and head into the darkest corners of the Appalachian folklore. We are about to encounter the legends of the ancient travelers, people who might have crossed the ocean thousands of years before Columbus was even born. Was the Portuguese story just the tip of an iceberg that reaches back to the dawn of civilization? The mountain soil is ready to give up its secrets, but are we ready to hear them? Stay with us, because the mystery of the forbidden blood is about to take a turn into the truly impossible. We are going back further than the ships, further than the forts, to a time when the world was much smaller, and the mountains were the only refuge for those who knew the secrets of the stars. As we climb higher into the jagged peaks of the Appalachians, the air grows thinner, and the stories grow stranger. We have looked at the lost colonists of England and the shipwrecked sailors of Portugal. But what if the true origins of the Melungeons are buried even deeper in the earth? What if the mystery doesn't span centuries, but millennia? To even suggest this is to invite the scorn of mainstream historians, yet the mountains themselves seem to hold on to a truth that defies the textbooks. There is a shadow that stretches across the Atlantic, reaching back to a time when the Mediterranean was the center of a world we are only now beginning to rediscover. We are talking about the Phoenicians, the master mariners of antiquity, the people who navigated by the stars long before the compass was a dream. The theory of ancient travelers in America is often dismissed as fringe science, but for the Melungeons, it provides a hauntingly logical explanation for things that otherwise make no sense. Why would a group of people in the isolated woods of Tennessee have an oral tradition that speaks of ancient voyages? Why would they possess a genetic signature that links them to the Levant and the Middle East? Some researchers believe that the Melungeons are not a modern mixture of races, but the remnants of a very old one, a group of ancient explorers who crossed the vast, terrifying expanse of the ocean in search of the copper and tin that lay hidden in the American soil. Consider the Bat Creek Stone. In 1889, an archaeological dig in a burial mound in Tennessee uncovered a small, unassuming piece of siltstone. On its surface were 8 mysterious characters. For decades, it was dismissed as a Cherokee inscription. But in the 1970s, scholars specializing in ancient languages took a second look. When they flipped the stone, they realized they weren't looking at Cherokee at all. They were looking at a form of ancient Paleo-Hebrew, a script used by the Phoenicians and their neighbors. The inscription roughly translated to, "For the Judeans." If this stone is authentic, it means that people from the Mediterranean were living, dying, and burying their dead in the heart of Melungeon country more than 1,000 years before Columbus was born. For the Melungeons, such a discovery is like finding a missing limb. It explains the Mediterranean look that has haunted their families for generations. It explains why their DNA results often come back with hits from Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria. The Phoenicians were known to establish colonies far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, stretching their reach to the British Isles and the coast of Africa. Is it so impossible to believe that a storm or a daring captain pushed one of these vessels across the Atlantic? If they landed on the American coast, they would have followed the rivers inland, seeking the high ground for protection. They would have found the Appalachians, a place that felt like home, and there they would have stayed, becoming a lost tribe, long before the term was ever invented. But the evidence isn't just in the stones. It is in the very culture of the mountains. Travelers in the early 19th century often remarked on the strange non-European customs of the Melungeon people. They spoke of Turkish-style clothing, of women who wore head coverings in a way that mirrored the Mediterranean world, and of a specific type of weaving that utilized patterns found in ancient North Africa. Even their religious practices were noted for being unusual, a blend of Christianity and something older, something more ritualistic that seemed to echo the ancient world. They were a people who kept the Sabbath on Saturday long before the arrival of modern Seventh-day Adventists. Were these just coincidences, or were they the fading embers of a Phoenician or Carthaginian heritage? The implications of this are terrifying to those who want history to remain neat and tidy. If the Melungeons are the descendants of ancient Mediterranean sailors, it means our entire understanding of the discovery of America is a lie. It means that the Appalachians weren't a wilderness waiting to be tamed, but a sanctuary for a global community that had been living there for eons. The Melungeons, in this light, are not outcasts of the American South, but the guardians of a secret history. They are the living evidence of a world where the oceans were not barriers, but bridges. Think about the physical appearance we discussed earlier: the dark skin, the blue eyes, the fine features. This is the exact description of the ancient people of the Levant. When you look at a Melungeon face, you might not be looking at a product of the colonial frontier. You might be looking at the face of an ancient Carthaginian sailor or a Phoenician trader. This would explain why they never fit into the categories of black or white. They belonged to a category that the American census didn't even have a name for. They were the people of the ancient sea, trapped in the mountains of a new world. There is a psychological weight to this theory as well. The Melungeons have always been a people who felt out of place. They were treated as aliens in their own land. Perhaps that feeling of being an outsider wasn't just about the laws of the 1800s. Perhaps it was a deep, ancestral memory of being far from home. The isolation of Newman's Ridge wasn't just a choice for safety. It was a way to preserve a bloodline that was older than the country itself. They stayed in the high places because the high places were where they could watch the stars, the same stars their ancestors used to guide their ships across the wine-dark sea. Of course, the ancient traveler theory is a lightning rod for controversy. Skeptics argue that the Bat Creek stone is a forgery, or that the genetic markers are simply the result of later migrations. But the skeptics cannot explain the persistence of the Melungeon identity. They cannot explain why a people with no access to ancient history books would claim an origin that matches the archaeological evidence so closely. The Melungeons didn't need a PhD to tell them who they were. They had the stories passed down from grandmother to grandchild, whispered in the dark so the neighbors wouldn't hear. As we look at the mist rising from the valleys below, we have to wonder what else is buried beneath the roots of the ancient oaks. How many more stones are waiting to be found? How many more secrets are hidden in the double helix of Melungeon DNA? The story of the forbidden blood is no longer just a local mystery. It is a global epic. It is a story that connects a small ridge in Tennessee to the ancient ports of Tyre and Sidon. But as fascinating as the ancient world is, we cannot forget the people who lived through the reality of the 19th century. While historians argue over stones and scripts, the Melungeons were fighting a much more immediate battle. They were fighting for their right to exist in a world that wanted to erase them. And in that battle, they would find their greatest champion and their most legendary figure, a woman whose name still echoes through the mountains like a clap of thunder, a woman who proved that Melungeon blood wasn't just forbidden, it was invincible. Get ready to meet the woman who became the face of a people, a figure of such immense power and mystery that the law itself was afraid to touch her. We are moving from the ancient past into the heart of the legend of Mahala Mullins. The Appalachian Mountains are more than just a geographic feature on a map. They are a labyrinth of ancient stone, a place where the earth itself seems to fold in on its own secrets. For the Melungeons, these mountains were not just a home, they were a fortress of isolation. To understand why they lived where they did, you have to understand the sheer desperation of their circumstances. Most settlers in the 18th and 19th centuries arrived in the New World looking for the richest soil, the widest valleys, and the easiest paths to commerce. But the Melungeons did the opposite. They climbed. They retreated to the highest, most inaccessible ridges, places like Newman Ridge in Tennessee and the steep slopes of southwest Virginia. They chose the land that no one else wanted, the land where the soil was thin, the winters were brutal, and the mist never truly lifted. Why would a people voluntarily exile themselves to the edges of the habitable world? The answer lies in the safety of shadows. In the valleys below, the world was governed by laws that saw the Melungeons as a threat. In the valleys, there were census takers, tax collectors, and slave catchers. In the valleys, skin color was a document that dictated your destiny. But on the ridges, the only law was survival. The fortress of isolation was built out of a necessity to be invisible. The higher they climbed, the harder they were to find. The more rugged the terrain, the less likely it was that a sheriff or a hostile neighbor would bother to make the trek. They became a people of the high places, watching the world from above, forever on the lookout for the approach of the outside. Life on the ridges was a grueling test of human endurance. While the valley farmers enjoyed the deep, fertile silt of the riverbeds, the Melungeons had to coax corn and beans out of rocky ground that seemed to resent the plow. Every calorie was earned through back-breaking labor. Yet, this shared hardship forged a community that was tighter than any legal contract. Because the world had rejected them, they clung to each other with a fierce, unbreakable loyalty. They built cabins out of the very timber they cleared, and they created a society where your neighbor was your only lifeline. If a barn burned down or a crop failed, the community stepped in, not because they were rich, but because they knew that isolation meant they were all they had. This isolation did something profound to the Melungeon identity. It acted as a time capsule. While the rest of America was rapidly changing, industrializing, and mixing, the Melungeons remained frozen in a peculiar, beautiful stasis. On the ridges, the old songs were still sung in the old ways. The ancient stories of Portuguese ancestors and lost ships were kept alive by the hearth fire because there was no one from the outside to laugh at them or tell them they were wrong. The fortress of isolation wasn't just a physical barrier of rock and forest. It was a mental barrier. They developed a culture of intense secrecy. They learned to speak in riddles when strangers were near. they learned the Melungeons stare, a silent, unreadable gaze that told an outsider they were not welcome in these heights. There is a haunting beauty to this era of their history. Imagine the mountain nights, where the only light came from the moon reflecting off the limestone cliffs. In these moments, the Melungeons weren't outcasts. They were the kings and queens of their own private kingdom. They had their own healers, their own music, and their own way of understanding the spirit world. They lived in harmony with a landscape that everyone else found terrifying. They knew the secret paths through the laurel thickets and the hidden springs that never ran dry. The mountains protected them, but they also demanded a high price. To live in the fortress, you had to accept that you would forever be a stranger to the nation growing at your feet. But the isolation wasn't just about avoiding the law. It was about protecting the children. Melungeon parents knew that as soon as their sons and daughters left the ridge, they would be judged. They would be called free persons of color, a term that stripped them of their dignity. They would be mocked for their brass skin and their glass eyes. So, the parents kept them close. They built a world where being Melungeon was the norm, not the exception. Inside the fortress, a child didn't have to wonder why they looked different. They only had to look at their father, their grandmother, and their cousins to see themselves reflected back. The ridge was a sanctuary of self-worth in a world that wanted to tell them they were worthless. As the 19th century wore on, the pressure from the outside world began to mount. The population of the United States was exploding, and the empty spaces of the Appalachians were being filled. The coal companies began to look at the mountains with greedy eyes. The timber industry started to carve paths into the ancient forests. The fortress of isolation was being breached. The Melungeons could no longer simply hide. They were being forced into a confrontation with a legal system that was becoming increasingly obsessed with racial purity. The walls of stone and mist were no longer enough to keep the world at bay. The tragedy of the fortress is that it eventually became a prison. The very isolation that had saved their lives also limited their opportunities. Because they lived on the ridges, they were often the last to receive education, the last to get medical care, and the last to benefit from the growing American economy. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty that the rest of the world used as proof of their inferiority. They were called mountain trash or degenerate, ignoring the fact that it was the world's own cruelty that had driven them into the rocks in the first place. Yet, even as the walls began to crumble, the spirit of the fortress remained. The Melungeons didn't give up their identity. They simply adapted it. They learned how to navigate the legal systems of the valleys while still returning to the safety of the ridges at night. They became masters of the in-between. They were people who could walk in both worlds but belonged truly to only one. The mist of Newman's Ridge became a part of their soul, a layer of protection they carried with them even when they finally descended into the towns and cities. We must look at this period of isolation as the forge in which the modern Melungeon was made. Without the ridges, they would have been swallowed up by the great American melting pot, their unique DNA, and their ancient stories lost to history. The fortress of isolation saved the mystery. It kept the forbidden blood pure in its own way, shielded from the erasing hand of progress. But the peace of the ridges was about to be shattered by the gavel of a judge. The next chapter of their story isn't one of hiding, but of fighting. The Melungeons were about to be dragged into the light of the courtroom, where their very right to exist would be put on trial. What happens when a people who have lived in the shadows for a century are forced to defend their blood in front of a world that fears them. The battles were about to begin, and the stakes were nothing less than the survival of their families and their land. The mountains had held them, but now the law would try to break them. Imagine standing in a crowded, sweltering courtroom in the mid-1800s. The air is thick with the scent of tobacco and prejudice. You are not there because you stole a horse or burned a barn. You are there because of the blood moving through your veins. In the eyes of the state of Tennessee, your very ancestry is a crime. A judge looks down from his bench, his eyes searching your face for any sign of the taint. This was the reality for the Melungeons. For over a century, the American legal system was obsessed with a single, impossible question. What are you? In a society built on the binary of black and white, the Melungeons were a glitch in the machine, and the law was determined to fix it by erasing them. Before we witness the heart-wrenching battles fought in these courtrooms, take a moment to subscribe and join our community. By following this series, you are helping to preserve a history that was almost wiped from the record. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the legendary story of Mahala Mullins coming up next. The legal persecution of the Melungeons was rooted in a terrifying concept known as the one-drop rule. According to this logic, a single drop of non-white blood was enough to render a person colored in the eyes of the law. For the Melungeons, who had lived as free people for generations, this was a death sentence for their civil rights. If a court declared you mulatto, or free person of color, you suddenly lost the right to vote. You could no longer serve on a jury. You couldn't testify against a white person. Most terrifyingly, you could lose your land. White settlers, hungry for the ridges and valleys the Melungeons had tamed, often used the legal system as a weapon, challenging Melungeon land titles by claiming they weren't legally white and therefore had no right to own property. One of the most famous and agonizing cases occurred in the 1840s. It was the trial of a Melungeon man whose right to vote had been challenged at the ballot box. The case wasn't about his character or his contribution to the community. It was a physical examination of his heritage. Witness after witness was called to describe his features. Did his hair curl like a European's, or was it straight like an Indian's? Was the darkness of his skin a healthy tan, or a racial mark? The courtroom became a theater of the absurd. Doctors were brought in to measure the bridges of noses and the shapes of ears. The Melungeon defendant had to stand before his neighbors while they debated his humanity, as if he were a piece of livestock. The defense in these trials often leaned on the Portuguese claim we discussed earlier. It was a desperate, brilliant legal maneuver. By claiming they were of Mediterranean descent, Portuguese, Spanish, or even Turkish, the Melungeons were providing a loophole for the judges. If the court accepted that their dark skin came from an Old World European source, they could be classified as white. This led to some of the strangest legal rulings in American history. Judges, sometimes out of a sense of local loyalty or personal friendship with Melungeon families, would issue decrees stating that a person was white despite their appearance, based solely on the Portuguese defense. It was a fragile peace, a legal fiction that allowed families to survive, but it came at the cost of their true history. But not every judge was kind. In many districts, the legal system was used to systematically dismantle Melungeon communities. The inquiry into the Melungeons in the 1880s was a particularly dark chapter. Local officials in Hancock County began a campaign to reclassify hundreds of families. Children were barred from white schools, forced into colored schools, or more often, left with no education at all, because they didn't fit into the colored schools either. This was the birth of the tri-racial isolate label, a way for the government to group people who were neither black, white, nor indigenous into a category of permanent outcasts. The psychological toll of these court battles cannot be overstated. Imagine the fear of a Melungeon mother watching her children play, knowing that at any moment a neighbor's grudge or a lawyer's greed could result in her family being stripped of their status. This fear bred a culture of hypervigilance. Melungeons learned to be impeccable citizens. They were deeply religious, incredibly hardworking, and fiercely private. They knew that any slip-up, any sign of trouble, would give the legal system an excuse to pounce. They lived on a razor's edge, always one court ruling away from losing everything they had built. There were also the miscegenation laws. In many states, it was illegal for a white person to marry someone of non-white descent. For Melungeon families who had intermarried with white settlers, this created a legal nightmare. Marriages were declared void. Children were declared illegitimate. The law was literally trying to tear families apart at the seams. Some Melungeons fought back by moving further into the mountains, away from the jurisdiction of the county seats. Others chose to pass as white, moving to distant towns and cutting all ties with their families, carrying the secret of their Melungeon blood like a hidden scar. Perhaps the most insidious part of the legal battle was the census. Every 10 years, the government would arrive to count the people. For a Melungeon, the census taker was a figure of dread. Depending on the official's personal bias, a family could be listed as W for white, B for black, or M for mulatto. These records were then used in court as proof of racial identity. A family that had been white in 1850 could find themselves mulatto in 1860, with no way to appeal the change. This bureaucratic flip-flopping kept the Melungeons in a state of perpetual identity crisis, never knowing from one decade to the next what rights they would be allowed to keep. Even into the 20th century, the legal shadow remained. During the era of the eugenics movement, some officials in Virginia and Tennessee targeted Melungeon communities for sterilization, viewing them as genetically inferior or mongrels who would pollute the white race. The law, which was supposed to protect the people, became the very tool used to attempt their extinction. They were treated as a biological problem to be solved by the state. Yet, through all of this, the Melungeons stayed. They stayed on their ridges. They kept their names. They kept their pride. The courtrooms didn't break the Melungeons. They forged them into a people of steel. Every time a judge ruled in their favor, it was a victory for survival. Every time they were persecuted, it deepened their bond to one another. They learned that the law might be written by the powerful, but the truth was written in the blood. They realized that if they were to survive as a people, they couldn't rely on the justice of the valleys. They had to create their own justice, their own legends, and their own icons. As we move away from the cold, clinical world of the law, we enter the realm of the mountain legends. The courtrooms tried to define the Melungeons as a problem, but the people themselves defined their identity through figures who were larger than life, figures who laughed at the law and defied the census. This brings us to the most defiant Melungeon of them all, a woman who lived on the ridge and dared the sheriff to come and get her. She was a bootlegger, a healer, and a giant in both stature and spirit. The law could handle a man in a suit, but it had no idea how to handle Big Mahala. In the next part of our journey, we step out of the courtroom and onto the porch of a cabin that the law was afraid to enter. The history of the Melungeons is a history of survival, and no one survived quite like Mahala Mullins. The law is a powerful, cold, and calculated machine, but even the strongest machine can be stopped by something as simple as a doorway. In the annals of American history, there are outlaws who ran, outlaws who fought, and then there was Mahala Mullins. Known to the world as Big Haley, she was a woman who didn't need to hide in the shadows of Newman's Ridge. She sat right in the center of her cabin, a mountain of a woman, a queen of the Melungeons, and a master of the forbidden trade. While the courts were busy debating the color of Melungeon blood, Mahala was busy proving that if you were bold enough, the law couldn't touch you, even if it was standing right in your living room. If you are captivated by the defiant spirit of the Melungeons, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who loves hidden history. Your support allows us to keep digging into these incredible archives. Now let's go back to the ridge, to the cabin where the law met its match. Mahala Mullins was a titan. Local legend says she weighed anywhere from 400 to over 600 pounds. In a time when life on the ridge was lean and hard, her sheer size was a testament to her vitality and, perhaps, her secret success. She was a mother to nearly 20 children, a healer who knew the secrets of every root and herb in the forest, and most famously, she was the most successful moonshiner in the Appalachians. Her apple brandy was said to be so smooth it could make a preacher forget his Sunday sermon, and her whiskey was the liquid gold of Hancock County. The revenue agents, the dreaded revenuers, knew exactly where she was. They didn't have to hunt her through the laurel thickets or track her across the limestone cliffs. Her cabin on Newman's Ridge was a well-known destination. They would march up the mountain, fueled by federal authority and the desire to shut down her illegal still. They would burst through her door, warrants in hand, ready to haul the Melungeon queen to jail, and every single time they would stop dead in their tracks. Mahala wouldn't run. She couldn't. She spent the later years of her life confined to an oversized bed in the center of her home. She would look at the agents with those piercing Melungeon eyes, the eyes of an ancient sea traveler trapped in a mountain body, and she would simply smile. The agents would look at Mahala, then they would look at the door. The doorway was a standard mountain frame, narrow and sturdy. Mahala was far, far wider than the exit. The dilemma became a legendary piece of Appalachian folklore. The sheriff of Hancock County once famously told the federal agents, "She's catchable, but she ain't fetchable." They could arrest her, they could read her rights, and they could stand there and watch her all day long. But they couldn't get her out of the house without tearing down the walls, and at the time, the law didn't give them the authority to destroy a woman's home just to arrest her for moonshining. So, for years, a stalemate existed on the ridge. Mahala Mullins continued to brew her spirits, continued to raise her family, and continued to live as a free woman, protected by the very cabin that imprisoned her. But to see Mahala only as a colorful moonshiner is to miss the deeper significance of her life. To the Melungeon people, she was a matriarch of survival. In a world that told them they were mongrels and outcasts, Mahala was a giant who refused to shrink. She was a provider. Her moonshine business wasn't just about breaking the law. It was about feeding a community that had been pushed off the fertile lands and denied a place in the legitimate economy. She turned the rocky soil and the mountain fruit into a way of life. When a neighbor was sick, it was Mahala's herbs that healed them. When a family was starving, it was Mahala's table that fed them. Her cabin became a sanctuary. Because the law was afraid or unable to enter effectively, it became a place where the Melungeon identity could breathe. Inside those walls, you weren't a free person of color or a mulatto. You were a guest of Big Haley. You were part of a lineage that was older than the United States. She was the keeper of the stories, the one who remembered the names of the ancestors who came from the sea. Her defiance was a silent, massive protest against the systems that tried to categorize and control her people. The stories of her interactions with the revenuers are the stuff of mountain myth. It said she once offered a frustrated agent a glass of her finest brandy while he sat by her bed, wondering how on earth he was going to explain his failure to his superiors. She treated them with a hospitable grace that made it almost impossible for them to hate her. She wasn't a violent criminal. She was a woman living by her own rules in a landscape that she understood better than any government official ever could. However, the tragedy of Mahala's life was the same tragedy that faced all Melungeons: the isolation. While she was a queen on the ridge, she was a prisoner of her own body and her own home. She couldn't see the world she was defying. She could only hear the wind through the pines and the voices of the people who climbed the ridge to see her. She bore the weight of her people's history, literally and figuratively. Her life was a sacrifice of mobility for the sake of endurance. When Mahala Mullins finally passed away in 1898, the problem of the doorway returned one last time. Even in death, she refused to fit into the world's narrow openings. To give her a proper burial, her family and neighbors had to do what the law never dared. They had to remove a section of the cabin wall. They carried her out through the side of the house she had occupied for so long, finally releasing her from the fortress she had built. She was buried on the ridge, overlooking the valleys that had tried so hard to claim her and failed. The passing of Mahala Mullins marked the end of an era. She was the last of the great Melungeon matriarchs, a bridge to a time when the mystery was still a lived reality. After her death, the pressure on the Melungeons to assimilate or disappear intensified. The fetchable generation was coming. The children who would leave the ridge, who would hide their accents, and who would try to wash the mountain dust from their skin. But the legend of Big Haley remained. It became a shield for the Melungeon soul. Whenever a young man or woman felt the sting of prejudice in the towns below, they could think of their aunt, their grandmother, their queen on the ridge. They could remember that the law isn't always right, and that the truth of who you are is bigger than any doorway the world tries to force you through. Mahala's story is a reminder that history isn't just made by generals and presidents. It's made by people who stand or sit their ground. It's made by those who find a way to turn their limitations into their greatest strength. But as the legend of Mahala grew, so did the darker whispers about the Melungeons. Now that their greatest protector was gone, the shadows of the mountains began to feel heavier. People started to talk about the blue people, the night walkers, and the ancient curses that supposedly haunted the forbidden blood. In our next chapter, we leave the warmth of Mahala's hearth and step into the chilling folklore and dark legends that have surrounded the Melungeons for centuries. What were the neighbors so afraid of? And why did the Melungeons themselves start to believe that their blood was truly cursed? The mist is thickening, and the stories are about to take a terrifying turn. The wind on Newman's Ridge doesn't just blow, it whispers. If you listen closely enough on a night when the moon is hidden behind the thunderheads, you can hear the voices of those who were never meant to be remembered. But the neighbors in the valleys didn't just listen, they feared. They told stories that would turn a man's blood to ice. They spoke of a people who weren't quite human, a tribe that walked the line between the living and the dead. This is the dark side of the Melungeon mystery, where history ends and the nightmare begins. Before we step into the shadows of these mountain myths, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten stories back into the light. Now, let us look at the monsters created by isolation. In the 19th century, the word Melungeon was more than a label. It was a warning. Because they were so isolated, because they were so different, the imagination of the surrounding communities began to rot. People started to report seeing things in the high ridges that defied logic. They spoke of the blue people. Now, modern science tells us about rare genetic conditions. But to a farmer in 1850, seeing a person with skin the shade of a bruised plum was a sign of a demonic curse. They believed the Melungeons carried a blue blood that was a mark of Cain, a physical stain for some ancient, unspoken sin committed at the dawn of time. They said that on nights of the full moon, the blue tint would glow, a cold and unearthly light that signaled a gathering of the forbidden tribe. The legends didn't stop at the color of their skin. There were whispers of the night walkers. It was said that the Melungeons didn't sleep like other men. People claimed to see them moving through the dense laurel thickets in total darkness, navigating the jagged limestone cliffs as if they had the eyes of a cat. There were stories that they could transform into wolves or large black dogs to protect their ridges from intruders. This wasn't just harmless folklore. It was a tool of dehumanization. By turning the Melungeons into monsters, the outside world made it easier to justify their persecution. If they weren't human, if they were wolf people, then they didn't deserve the protection of the law. Families in the valleys would bar their doors at sunset, terrified that a Melungeon shapeshifter might be lurking in the shadows of their barns. Inside the Melungeon community, the folklore was different, but no less haunting. They had their own granny magic, a blend of European herbalism, Native American spirituality, and perhaps remnants of Mediterranean mysticism. They believed in the evil eye. A Melungeon mother would never let a stranger stare too long at her child, for fear that their spirit would be withered by a look of envy. They saw omens in the flight of crows and the way the fog settled in the hollows. They believed that the ridges were inhabited by the Old Ones, ancestors who had arrived on the ships from the sea and had never truly left. They didn't fear the ghosts. They respected them as the guardians of their secret blood. They would leave small offerings of corn or tobacco on flat stones, a silent contract between the living and the dead. One of the most terrifying legends was the curse of the silent child. It was believed that every few generations, a child would be born who could see into the future, but was forbidden from ever speaking a word. These children were kept hidden in the deepest parts of the cabins, treated as oracles for the family, but as ghosts by the world. The neighbors would see a flicker of a face in a window that shouldn't have been there, and the rumor would spread. The Melungeons are hiding something unholy. The silence of the Melungeons, born of a need for survival, was interpreted by the outside world as a sign of occult secrets. They were thought to possess books of black magic, bound in the skin of their enemies, containing spells that could turn the weather or rot a neighbor's crops. Then there were the lights of Newman's Ridge. Even today, hikers and locals report seeing strange, glowing orbs that dance along the peaks where the old Melungeon cemeteries are located. Some call them ghost lights, others call them haints. But to the Melungeons, these were the lanterns of their forefathers, still searching for the way back to a sea they had lost centuries ago. They were seen as spirits that refused to rest until their true name was spoken by the world. The mountains were alive with these stories. Every rock had a name, and every name had a tragedy attached to it. The folklore became a way for the Melungeons to map their own suffering, turning their exile into a supernatural epic. But perhaps the darkest legend of all was the stigma of the leper. In the early 1900s, a cruel theory circulated that the Melungeons were the descendants of a lost colony of lepers who had been cast out of Europe and abandoned in the wilderness. People were terrified of catching the Melungeon sickness, a spiritual and physical rot that they believed could be passed through a single touch or a shared cup. This led to a social quarantine that was more effective than any prison wall. The Melungeons were treated as the walking dead, a people whose very presence was a threat to the purity of the world. Shopkeepers would refuse their money, and churches would bar their entry, fearing that the forbidden blood carried a contagion of the soul. Even the music of the ridge was seen as cursed. The haunting, mournful scales of their songs were said to draw out the sadness in a man's soul until he wandered off into the woods, never to be seen again. It was called the Melungeon Lonesome. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a force. It was the weight of 300 years of being told you don't belong anywhere on God's green earth. Some said that if you heard a Melungeon fiddle playing in the distance at midnight, you should cover your ears and run, or you would be lured into the mist and become one of them, a ghost trapped between the worlds. As we sit in the silence of these dark legends, we have to realize that the folklore was a mirror. It reflected the fear of the outsiders and the resilience of the outcasts. The monsters on the ridge were just families trying to stay warm. The ghosts in the mist were just grandfathers who refused to be forgotten. The strange lights were just the flicker of hope in a world of darkness. But beneath the layers of myth and the whispers of curses, there was a biological truth that was even more shocking than the stories. The legends were a mask for a genetic reality that science is only now beginning to grasp. The blue people weren't just a myth. The strange features weren't just a curse. They were the result of an incredible rare convergence of human history and DNA. As we leave the campfire of folklore behind, we must step into the cold, clinical light of the laboratory. We are about to look at the genetic anomalies of the Melungeons, the physical markers that prove they were truly a people apart. Why did some of them have skin that turned blue? Why did they carry diseases that only exist in the Mediterranean? The answers are hidden in their cells, and the truth is far more incredible than any ghost story. The mist is clearing, and the microscope is waiting. It is time to face the reality of the forbidden blood. The horror is fading into science, but the mystery is only getting deeper. Imagine the silence of a delivery room in a remote mountain cabin. The only sound is the crackle of the hearth and the heavy breathing of a midwife. A child is born, but as the mother reaches out to hold her newborn, she gasps in horror. The infant is not pink or copper. The child is blue. Not the blue of a cold body, but a vibrant indigo hue that seems to pulsate under the skin. For generations, this was the ultimate omen of the forbidden blood. To the neighbors, it was a mark of the devil. To the parents, it was a secret that had to be buried. But as the 20th century brought the light of modern medicine into the hollows, we discovered that the blue people were not a myth or a curse. They were a biological miracle, a living map of a journey that began thousands of miles away. Before we unlock the genetic vault of the Melungeons and see the evidence hidden in their very cells, please take a moment to subscribe. We are piecing together a 300-year-old puzzle, and your support helps us keep the investigation alive. Tell us in the comments, do you believe biology can ever truly lie about our past? The phenomenon of the blue-skinned people of Appalachia is one of the most striking anomalies in human history. While the famous Fugate family of Kentucky is the most well-known example of this, the Melungeon communities of Tennessee and Virginia had their own blue-tinted lineages. Science eventually gave this curse a name: methemoglobinemia. It is a rare genetic condition that reduces the blood's ability to carry oxygen, causing the blood itself to turn a deep chocolate brown. When seen through the translucent skin of a person with certain Mediterranean or European ancestry, this brown blood creates a visual illusion of bright blue or purple. In the isolated ridges, where families married within their own small communities for 200 years, this recessive gene flourished. What the world saw as a supernatural mark was actually the result of intense, forced isolation. But the blue skin was only the beginning of the genetic trail. As doctors began to treat Melungeon families in the mid-20th century, they noticed something impossible. These mountain people, who claimed to be simple farmers of English or Portuguese descent, were suffering from diseases that were almost exclusively found in people from the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Middle East. One of the most prominent was familial Mediterranean fever, or FMF. It is a painful, inflammatory disorder that causes recurring fevers and swelling in the chest and joints. Historically, FMF was found in Sephardic Jews, Armenians, Turks, and North African Arabs. Finding it in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains was like finding a desert cactus growing in the middle of a rainforest. It shouldn't have been there, yet it was written in the Melungeon DNA. Then there was Behçet's disease, another rare inflammatory condition that followed the path of the ancient Silk Road. Again, doctors found cases of this among the Melungeon descendants on Newman's Ridge. The evidence was becoming undeniable. The forbidden blood wasn't just a mixture of local races, it was an ancient cocktail of global lineages. The Melungeons were carrying the biological baggage of the Ottoman Empire, the Moorish caliphates, and the Jewish diaspora. Their bodies were telling the story of a massive secret migration that the history books had completely ignored. Every ache in their joints and every fever in their blood was a signal from an ancestor who had crossed the sea long ago. The genetic anomalies didn't stop with internal diseases. There were the physical markers that became part of Melungeon lore. We have mentioned the Anatolian bump, the bony knot at the base of the skull, and the shovel-shaped incisors. In the 1990s, researchers began to look at these traits not as individual quirks, but as a collective signature. The bump is highly prevalent in Central Asian and Middle Eastern populations. The shovel-shaped teeth are a classic marker of Native American or East Asian ancestry. When you find both on the same person, who also has blue eyes and carries a Mediterranean fever, you are looking at a human bridge. You are looking at a person whose ancestors met at a crossroads that shouldn't have existed in colonial America. Why did these traits persist for so long? The answer is the founder effect. Because the original Melungeon settlers were so few in number and so rejected by the outside world, their specific genetic quirks were magnified over time. A single ancestor with a rare Middle Eastern gene could, within 5 generations, pass that gene to hundreds of descendants on the ridge. The isolation of the fortress, which we discussed earlier, acted as a laboratory for these anomalies. The world's cruelty forced the Melungeons to keep their blood closed, and in doing so, the world unintentionally preserved a genetic record of the ancient world. But there is a tragedy in this science. For centuries, Melungeons who suffered from these conditions had no idea why. They lived in pain, thinking they were cursed by God or punished for their mixed blood. They were subjected to experimental treatments or simply left to suffer in the dark. The blue people were often hidden away in back rooms, protected from the prying eyes of neighbors who would use their skin color as an excuse for violence or institutionalization. The genetic reality was a burden that these families bore in total silence. They were the victims of a biological mystery they didn't have the tools to solve. As the science of genetics advanced, the Melungeons became a point of fascination for researchers. Some saw them as a living laboratory, a way to study how genes move and change over centuries of isolation. But for the Melungeon people themselves, the science was something much more personal. It was a form of vindication. For 300 years, they had been called liars for saying they were Portuguese or something else. Now, the DNA was proving that they were right. They weren't faking an exotic identity to escape racism. They were speaking a truth that their bodies had never forgotten. However, the blue people phenomenon eventually began to fade. As the ridges were opened up by roads and the Melungeons began to marry outside of their small communities, the recessive genes were diluted. The blue skin disappeared, the Anatolian bumps became less frequent, and the shovel-shaped teeth were lost in the wider American gene pool. The anomalies were being erased by the very thing the Melungeons had always wanted: integration. But before the traits vanished entirely, a new generation of scientists arrived on the scene, armed with the power of the Human Genome Project. They weren't just looking at skin color or bone structure anymore. They were looking at the Y chromosomes and the mitochondrial DNA, the unbroken lines that lead directly back to our first fathers and mothers. What they found would spark the greatest controversy in the history of Melungeon studies. It would pit brother against brother and scholar against scholar. The genetic anomalies had pointed the way, but the DNA test was about to provide the final, shocking answer. The truth about the forbidden blood was finally going to be mapped out, letter by letter, and no one was prepared for what the results would say. The era of the blue people was over, but the era of the DNA revolution was just beginning. If the blood carried the fevers of the Mediterranean and the marks of the Middle East, what would the final analysis reveal? Was it really a lost colony? A shipwrecked crew? Or something even more complex? A secret alliance of outcasts that formed the first true global community in the heart of the American wilderness? Prepare yourself, because the next chapter takes us into the heart of the modern laboratory, where the dust of the mountains meets the precision of the computer. We are going to reveal the exact percentages, the specific homelands, and the final solution to the 300-year-old enigma. The blood is about to speak, and it has a lot to say. Dachi, emtieptuk trien kai fan moimod, jaila fan bong non hatvemat thong tin, noin hong bien hang theki juok juara, and sang doi kin hienvi, jaila buok ngoat thai joy hoan tuan jin hngkaya ven goi melungeon, gaira kasutu haulan hung kuok tran kain nai lua trong chin kong jong kwaho, kichban chi tiet, ngon nangu, English, approximately 2002. Style instructions: sharp, modern, and high stakes. The narrator should sound like they are reporting on a world-changing discovery. Use a tone of revelation and truth-seeking. Pacing should be fast during the description of the DNA boom, but slow down significantly when discussing the emotional impact of the results on the families. Full script, AI voice ready. English language. For 300 years, the truth about the Melungeons was a prisoner of the mist. It lived in the shape of a nose, the color of an eye, and the whispered stories of a grandmother. But in the late 20th century, the world changed. The era of guessing was over. The era of the double helix had arrived. We are entering the DNA revolution, a moment in history where science finally forced the mountain to give up its secrets. What began as a personal quest for one man would soon turn into a global headline, shattering the carefully constructed identities of thousands and forcing a nation to rethink its own origin story. The forbidden blood was about to be mapped, and the results would be more shocking, more diverse, and more controversial than anyone, historian or Melungeon, had ever dared to imagine. Before we reveal the specific percentages and the ancestral homelands hidden in the Melungeon genome, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We are reaching the climax of this epic mystery, and you won't want to be left in the dark for the final revelations. Now, let's step into the laboratory where history was rewritten. The catalyst for this revolution was a man named Brent Kennedy. In the 1980s, Kennedy was a successful professional who suddenly fell ill with a mysterious, debilitating sickness. After months of confusion, he was diagnosed with familial Mediterranean fever, the same forbidden fever we discussed in the last chapter. Kennedy was stunned. He was a man from the mountains of Virginia, raised to believe he was of Scotch, Irish, and English stock. How could he have a disease that belonged to the shores of the Mediterranean? This personal crisis turned into an obsession. Kennedy began to look at his family, his neighbors, and the people of Newman Ridge with new eyes. He saw the Portuguese features that had been hidden in plain sight. He realized that the stories weren't just folklore. They were a biological trail. In the early 1990s, Kennedy organized the first large-scale DNA study of the Melungeon people. He convinced hundreds of descendants to provide samples, promising them that the truth would finally set them free. The tension was palpable. For some, the test was a hope for dignity, a way to prove their European or exotic heritage once and for all. For others, the test was a threat. It was a potential exposure of the very secrets their ancestors had died to protect. When the results finally came back, they hit the Appalachian communities like a thunderbolt. The data revealed a tapestry of human movement that was breathtaking in its complexity. The DNA showed that the Melungeons were not a single race or a lost colony. They were a vibrant, multi-continental alliance. The tests found significant markers from Northern Europe, English, Irish, and German, as expected. But layered beneath that was the evidence of a secret history. There was DNA from sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. There were markers that pointed directly to the Sephardic Jews of Spain and the Moors of the Mediterranean. The Portuguese claim that had been used in courtrooms for centuries wasn't just a legal trick. It was a simplified version of a much more spectacular reality. The Melungeons were the first true global Americans, the result of a massive, undocumented mixing of outcasts that occurred long before the borders of the United States were ever drawn. However, the DNA revolution did not bring peace. Instead, it sparked a civil war of identity. The discovery of African DNA was particularly explosive. For generations, many Melungeon families had fought hard to distance themselves from any African heritage to avoid the brutal sting of Jim Crow laws. To be told by a scientist in a white coat that their Portuguese skin actually carried the legacy of enslaved people or free persons of color from the early colonies was, for some, an unbearable insult. They felt that the science was attacking their pride, erasing the white status their ancestors had suffered to maintain. Families were split down the middle, with some embracing the new multiracial reality and others dismissing the DNA results as a conspiracy or mistake. But the science was relentless. Subsequent studies in the early 2000s, utilizing more advanced technology, confirmed the initial findings, but added even more layers. They found that the paternal lines, the fathers, were predominantly of sub-Saharan African and European origin, while the maternal lines, the mothers, were mostly Northern European and Native American. This told a specific haunting story of the early frontier. It was a story of men of color and white women who had been pushed to the fringes of colonial society, finding refuge and love in the only place that would have them, the high, hidden ridges of the Appalachians. The Melungeons weren't a mystery from a far-off land. They were a community born of the very tensions and taboos that built America. This revelation changed the way we look at the fortress of isolation. The fortress wasn't just built to hide from tax collectors. It was built to protect a love that was illegal in the valleys. It was built to raise children who wouldn't be categorized by the hatred of the world. The DNA results proved that the Melungeons had succeeded in creating a sanctuary of diversity centuries before the rest of the country even considered the idea. They were the pioneers of a post-racial world, surviving in the rocks because the world below wasn't ready for them. The impact of the DNA revolution reached far beyond the mountains. It challenged the pure white narrative of Appalachian history. For a long time, the region had been portrayed as a bastion of purely Scotch-Irish heritage. The Melungeon DNA proved that the mountains were actually a melting pot, a place where the unwanted and the forbidden of three continents came together to forge a new identity. This was a radical rethinking of American history. It suggested that the frontier was not just a line of conquest, but a space of incredible human blending. But as the dust settled on the DNA results, a new question emerged. If the Melungeons were such a diverse mix, why did they have such specific Mediterranean diseases? Why did the stories of the Turk and the Portuguese persist so strongly above all others? While the general DNA results gave us a broad map, they didn't fully explain the cultural artifacts or the specific medical anomalies that pointed so clearly to one part of the world. The DNA said they were mixed, but the soul of the Melungeons still felt an irresistible pull toward the east. This leads us to the most fascinating and specific part of the DNA journey. Beyond the broad categories of African or European, there were rare pinpoint markers that didn't belong in the standard American gene pool. These were markers that pointed to a very specific time and a very specific place, the Ottoman Empire during the height of its power. The DNA was whispering about a group of people known as the Levantine traders and the lost Turks of the Appalachians. How did people from the heart of the Ottoman Empire end up in the forests of Tennessee? The answer wasn't in the broad strokes of a census report, but in the secret history of the Mediterranean slave trade and the desperate journeys of those who escaped it. The DNA revolution had opened the door, but we were about to walk through it into a world of janissaries, secret Jews, and the forgotten alliance between the Sultan and the New World. The blood has been mapped, but the journey of those who carried it is still a secret, waiting to be told. Get ready to leave the laboratory and cross the ocean. We are going to find the specific point where the East met the West, and why that meeting was so dangerous that it had to be hidden for 300 years. The true Mediterranean connection is about to be revealed. The map of the human heart is rarely a straight line. To find the soul of the Melungeons, we must leave the jagged cliffs of Appalachia and fly east, across the cold Atlantic, past the Pillars of Hercules, and into the warm, turquoise waters of the Mediterranean. For 3 centuries, we have looked at the Melungeons as a local American curiosity. But the truth is far more expansive. The DNA has spoken, and it whispers of an empire that once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia. We are talking about the Ottoman Empire, and the secret Mediterranean connection that changed the face of the American frontier long before the first English flag was ever planted in the soil of Tennessee. If you are ready to see how the history of the world is interconnected in ways they never taught you in school, make sure to subscribe and share this series. We are uncovering a global epic, and your support keeps us digging. Now let us look at the ships that brought the East to the West. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Mediterranean was a boiling cauldron of conflict. The Ottoman Sultan and the kings of Europe were locked in a titanic struggle for the soul of the world. In this era of galley slaves and privateers, thousands of people were captured on the high seas. Among them were the Levantine traders, people from what is now Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria. Many of these sailors and merchants were captured by Spanish or Portuguese ships. Some were kept as slaves, while others were pressed into service as sailors on the very galleons that were beginning to explore the New World. The Mediterranean connection isn't just a theory. It is a trail of breadcrumbs left across the colonial records. We find reports of Turks and Moors being brought to the coast of the Americas as early as the late 1500s. Some were part of the crew on Spanish expeditions that ventured deep into the interior of the southeast, seeking the same gold and minerals that the ancient Phoenicians had sought thousands of years before. When these expeditions failed or were abandoned, these Mediterranean sailors did exactly what the DNA suggested. They stayed. They found the mountains, a landscape that reminded them of the rugged terrains of Anatolia or the Atlas Mountains, and they merged with the people they found there. This explains the specific medical anomalies we discussed, the Mediterranean fever and the rare skin conditions. These weren't random mutations. They were the biological heritage of the Ottoman world. Imagine a Turkish sailor, a man who once walked the bazaars of Istanbul, finding himself lost in the green wilderness of North Carolina. He would have carried with him not just his DNA, but his skills, his faith, and his stories. He would have taught his children how to farm on steep slopes and how to weave patterns that had been used in the Levant for generations. Over time, his specific history as a Turk would fade into the more generic label of Portuguese, which was a safer and more recognizable term for the English authorities. But the evidence isn't just in the blood. It is in the very artifacts found in Melungeon cabins. Early explorers in the Appalachians were often baffled to find Turkish-style rugs, curved swords, and copper vessels that looked as if they belonged in a Middle Eastern palace rather than a log cabin. There were the stories of the Graysons and other families who possessed ancient documents written in scripts that no one in the mountains could read, but which looked suspiciously like Arabic or Ottoman Turkish. These were the family Bibles of a different kind, records of a lineage that reached back to the Sultan's court. We must also consider the lost colony connection in a new light. Historians have recently uncovered evidence that the English weren't the only ones interested in Roanoke. There are records of Turkish sailors being liberated from Spanish ships by Sir Francis Drake and brought to the coast of North Carolina. Some scholars believe that these liberated Turks were left on the shores or joined the local tribes, eventually becoming part of the genetic melting pot that produced the Melungeons. This adds a layer of global politics to the mystery. The Melungeons weren't just a group of local outcasts. They were the survivors of a global naval war, a collection of refugees from the world's most powerful empires. This Mediterranean soul is what gave the Melungeons their unique resilience. They were a people who understood that boundaries were fluid. They had seen the fall of cities and the rise of empires. When the American government tried to categorize them, the Melungeons reached back into their deep ancestral memory. They knew they weren't black or white in the way the Americans defined it. They were Levantine. They were citizens of a world that was much larger than a Tennessee county. Their Portuguese defense was a clever adaptation of this truth, a way to maintain their dignity by claiming a heritage that the West respected, while secretly harboring the traditions of the East. The architecture of the mountains also holds clues. Some of the oldest Melungeon cabins featured stonework and arched doorways that were uncharacteristic of English frontier building, but perfectly matched the styles of the Mediterranean world. Even the way they organized their communities, small, tightly knit clusters of families on high ridges, mirrored the village structures of the Old World. They were recreating the only world they knew, a world of sun and stone in the middle of the American forest. But why was this connection so suppressed? Why didn't the Melungeons shout their Mediterranean heritage from the mountaintops? The answer is simple: fear. In the 17th and 18th centuries, being associated with the Ottoman Empire or the Muslim world was as dangerous as being associated with Africa. The Christian authorities of the colonies saw the infidel as a threat to the soul of the New World. To admit you were a Turk or a Moor was to invite a crusade to your doorstep. So, the Melungeons did what they had to do. They buried the rugs, they hid the curved swords, and they told their children to say they were Portuguese. They protected their lives by sacrificing their history. The tragedy of the Mediterranean connection is the loss of a grand narrative. If we had known the truth earlier, we would have seen the Appalachians not as an isolated backwater, but as a vibrant outpost of global history. We would have seen the Melungeons as the living proof that the world was connected long before the internet or the airplane. Every blue-eyed, dark-skinned child born on Newman's Ridge was a testament to the fact that the Ottoman Sultan and the English Queen were both ancestors of the American frontier. As we look at the results of the DNA revolution, we see that the Mediterranean markers are still there, persistent and defiant. They are the survivors of the great sea battles and the long voyages. But as the 20th century came to a close, the Melungeons faced a new challenge. The secret was out. The DNA had proven the connection. Now, they had to decide what to do with the truth. They had been forbidden blood for so long that being the Mediterranean pioneers was a shock to their system. In our next part, we look at the cultural echoes that still remain, the music, the spirit, and the soul of a people who have finally stopped running. How does a Melungeon today reconcile their mountain upbringing with their global DNA? The blood never forgets, and as the music of the ridge begins to play, we will hear the haunting strains of a melody that began in Istanbul and found its final home in the heart of America. The reclamation of identity has begun, and the forbidden blood is finally being celebrated as the noble lineage it always was. Stay with us as we witness the modern awakening of the Melungeons. The mountains are speaking, and the world is finally ready to listen. If the blood is the map of the Melungeon journey, then the music is its heartbeat. Listen closely to the wind as it whistles through the gap in Newman's Ridge. It doesn't just carry the scent of pine and damp earth. It carries a melody that has been traveling for 1,000 years. When you hear a mountain fiddle start to cry or a banjo begin its frantic rhythmic dance, you are hearing more than just Appalachian folk music. You are hearing the synthesis of the world. You are hearing the lonesome sound of an outcast people who turn their sorrow into a symphony and their isolation into a sacred anthem. This is the spirit of the Melungeons, a culture that refused to be silenced even when the law tried to erase their name. If you can feel the haunting beauty of this mountain spirit, please subscribe and join our community of history seekers. We are approaching the final chapters of this epic mystery, and your support ensures these voices are never forgotten. Leave a comment below if you've ever felt a deep, unexplainable connection to a piece of music from your past. Now, let us find the soul in the sound. To the casual listener, the music of the Appalachians, what we now call bluegrass or old-time music, sounds purely Scotch-Irish. But for the Melungeons, there was always something different, something other in the way they played. Musicologists have long noted that the Melungeon style of fiddling possessed a unique, drone-like quality. Instead of the bright, bouncy jigs of the British Isles, their music often carried a heavy, mournful undertone. It was a sound that echoed the ancient bagpipes of North Africa or the stringed lutes of the Mediterranean. It was a music of the in-between, a bridge between the European folk tradition and the rhythmic complexities of the Middle East and Africa. The banjo itself, an instrument with deep African roots, became a weapon of survival in the Melungeon home. In the hands of a mountain musician, the banjo wasn't just for celebration, it was for storytelling. The songs they sang were often riddles, containing fragments of their hidden history. They sang of the girl I left behind me, but in the Melungeon version, the girl often lived across a great blue water that didn't sound like the English Channel. They sang of the Portuguese traveler and the Turkish lady, preserving the memory of their Mediterranean ancestors in the only way that was safe, through the camouflage of a folk song. This spirit of adaptation extended into their faith. The Melungeons were deeply religious, but their Christianity was often layered with older, more mystical traditions. In the isolated mountain churches, the practice of lining out hymns, where a leader calls out a line and the congregation repeats it in a slow, haunting chant, took on a quality that some observers compared to the calls to prayer in the Levant. Their worship was physical, intense, and communal. They practiced foot washing and handled the challenges of life with a stoic, fatalistic grace that seemed to echo the Inshallah of their Eastern forefathers. They believed that God was in the ridges and the mist, a protector of the outcasts who saw past the labels of men. But there was also a darker side to their spiritual life, the granny magic. This was the domain of the women, the healers like Mahala Mullins who understood that the mountain was a living, breathing entity. They used roots, barks, and berries, not just for medicine, but for protection. They spoke of haints and tokens, signs of approaching death or fortune. This wasn't just superstition. It was a way for a people who were denied an education to map their reality. They looked for the sign of the moon before planting their corn or marrying their children. This folk wisdom was a blend of Cherokee herb lore, European alchemy, and Mediterranean mysticism, a secret science passed down from mother to daughter in the privacy of the hearth. The Melungeon spirit was also defined by a fierce, quiet pride. Despite the name-calling and the legal battles, there was an internal dignity that outsiders couldn't break. It was seen in the way they kept their cabins immaculately clean, often decorated with the same geometric patterns found in Islamic or Sephardic art. It was seen in the way they treated guests. A Melungeon would share their last piece of cornbread with a stranger, practicing a level of hospitality that felt more like the desert traditions of the Middle East than the rugged individualism of the American frontier. To them, a guest was a blessing, a messenger from the world they had left behind. We must also talk about the lonesome. It is a word that appears constantly in Melungeon descriptions. It wasn't just sadness. It was a profound, ancestral yearning. It was the feeling of being a stranger in your own land, of carrying a history that you weren't allowed to tell. This lonesome is the secret ingredient in the music of the Ridge. It is that high, thin, wailing sound in the vocals that makes your hair stand on end. It is the sound of 100 people lost at Roanoke, 1,000 sailors shipwrecked from Portugal, and countless families driven into the rocks of Tennessee. The music didn't just express the pain, it exorcised it. As the 20th century progressed and the Melungeons began to leave the ridges, they took this music and spirit with them. They became the backbone of the burgeoning country music industry in Bristol and Nashville. Many of the early stars of the Grand Ole Opry carried Melungeon blood, though they rarely spoke of it. Their voices, filled with that ancient minor key sadness, became the sound of America. The forbidden blood was finally being heard on the radio, even if the listeners didn't know the name of the people who created it. The world was falling in love with the Melungeon soul, while still scorning the Melungeon name. But the spirit is not just in the past. Today, there is a cultural reclamation happening in the Appalachians. Young musicians are picking up the old fiddles and searching for the drones of their ancestors. They are looking at the traditional weaving patterns and seeing the geometry of the East. They are realizing that their granny's stories weren't just fairy tales. They were the survival manuals of a global people. The music is getting louder, and the lonesome is being replaced by a sense of belonging. The Melungeon spirit, once hidden in the shadows of a mountain cabin, is now a source of strength for a new generation. The echoes are no longer just fading memories. They are a call to action. To be Melungeon today is to embrace the complexity of the human story. It is to realize that you are a child of the world, born in the heart of the mountains. The music hasn't stopped. It has only changed its tune. But even as we celebrate the beauty of their culture, we cannot forget the reality of their struggle. The spirit was forged in fire, and the reclamation of their identity was a hard-fought battle. In our next chapter, we will meet the modern face of the Melungeons, the men and women who are stepping out of the mist and into the sunlight. We will see how they are using the DNA results and the cultural echoes to rebuild a community that was almost destroyed by silence. The forbidden blood is forbidden no more. It is being reclaimed, and the story of the modern reclamation is the ultimate triumph of the Melungeon mystery. The ridge is still there, the mist still rolls, but the voices are finally being heard. Get ready for the homecoming. For centuries, the word Melungeon was a heavy stone carried in the pocket of every child born on Newman's Ridge. It was a secret to be kept, a label to be feared, and a past to be forgotten. But imagine a different scene now. It is the dawn of the digital age, in a quiet house somewhere in the suburbs of America. An elderly woman sits in front of a glowing computer screen. With trembling fingers, she types a word she has only ever heard whispered in the dark corners of her childhood home. Melungeon. Suddenly, the screen floods with light. She sees faces that look like her father's. She sees stories that mirror her grandmother's. She realizes for the first time in 80 years that she is not alone. This is the moment the mist finally began to lift. The era of the forbidden blood was ending, and the era of the modern reclamation was born. If you have been moved by this journey of rediscovery, please subscribe and share your own family stories in the comments. We are witnessing the rebirth of a people, and every voice added to this conversation makes the history stronger. Now, let us see how a ghost tribe stepped out of the shadows and into the sun. The reclamation began, not in the courtrooms, but in the hearts of a generation that was tired of hiding. By the late 20th century, the legal dangers of being Melungeon had mostly faded, but the psychological scars remained. Many families had successfully passed into the white world, but they felt a strange, hollow ache, a sense that a vital piece of their soul had been left behind on the mountain. When the DNA results we discussed earlier started to go viral, it acted like a key in a rusted lock. People who had been told they were simply Scotch-Irish or Black Dutch started to ask the hard questions. They went into their attics and pulled out the old photos. They looked at the high cheekbones, the olive skin, and the blue eyes of their ancestors, and they stopped saying, "I don't know." They started saying, "I am." In the mid-1990s, this individual searching turned into a collective movement. The first Melungeon Union was held in Wise, Virginia. It was a gathering that many feared would be empty, but instead, thousands of people arrived. They came from the mountains, they came from the cities, and they came from across the country. It was a massive, emotional homecoming for a people who had been scattered by the winds of prejudice. People who had never met before looked into each other's eyes and saw their own reflections. They shared stories of Granny's secret and the Turkish rugs and the forbidden fevers. For the first time in history, the Melungeons weren't hiding from the world. They were celebrating themselves. This modern awakening changed the definition of what it means to be Melungeon. It shifted the focus from a racial problem to a cultural treasure. Organizations like the Melungeon Heritage Association were formed to document the history, preserve the cemeteries, and provide a space for descendants to connect. The scholars who had once dismissed the Melungeons as a triracial isolate were now faced with a community of thousands of active, proud researchers. The Melungeons were no longer the subjects of a study. They were the authors of their own story. They began to reclaim the ridges, not as places of exile, but as sacred ancestral ground. One of the most beautiful aspects of the reclamation is the healing of the racial divide. Because the DNA proved such a diverse mixture of African, European, Native American, and Mediterranean blood, the modern Melungeon identity has become a bridge. In a world that is still often divided by race, the Melungeons have embraced their global American status. They are proving that you don't have to be just one thing. You can be the son of a slave and the daughter of a queen. You can carry the blood of the Sultan and the heart of the Cherokee. This realization has turned a history of shame into a blueprint for a more inclusive future. The forbidden blood is now seen as a noble lineage of survivors who managed to harmonize the world's contradictions in their very cells. The internet played a crucial role in this explosion of pride. Online forums and genealogy databases allowed descendants to piece together the broken fragments of their family trees. Names that had been erased from the census or changed to sound more English were rediscovered. The fortress of isolation was replaced by a digital network of connection. A young man in California could find a cousin in Tennessee and realize they both had the same Anatolian bump at the back of their heads. The secrets that had been used to divide them were now the threads that bound them together. But the reclamation is not without its challenges. There are still those who prefer the silence. Some older family members who lived through the era of Big Haley and the harsh legal battles still feel the old fear. They worry that by speaking the name, they are inviting the old ghosts back. There is a tension between the younger generation, which wants to shout the truth from the mountaintops, and the elders, who still want to keep the door locked. The movement has had to proceed with grace and respect, honoring the silence of the past while building the voice of the future. We see the impact of this reclamation in the arts and education. Melungeon authors are writing the novels that were never written. Filmmakers are documenting the ridges. Teachers are finally mentioning the Melungeons in history classes as a vital part of the American frontier story. The Blue People are no longer a freak show in a tabloid. They are a recognized part of the genetic diversity of the human race. The mystery has not been solved in a way that makes it go away. It has been embraced in a way that makes it part of the fabric of who we are as a people. To be a Melungeon today is to be a guardian of a legacy. It is to know that your ancestors climbed the highest ridges so that you could eventually stand on your own 2 feet. It is to recognize that the forbidden blood is actually a source of immense strength and resilience. Every time a descendant stands up and says, "I am Melungeon," they are winning the battle that Mahala Mullins and John Sevier started centuries ago. They are proving that the mist cannot hide the truth forever. As we look at the faces of the modern Melungeons, we see a vibrant, diverse, and proud community that is no longer afraid of its own shadow. The journey from the Mediterranean galleys to the Appalachian ridges and finally to the digital world is one of the greatest survival stories in human history. They were the people who were never supposed to exist, yet here they are, stronger than ever. The reclamation is complete, but the story is not over. There is one final chapter to tell. We have looked at the ships, the DNA, the legends, and the modern awakening. Now we must ask, what does this all mean for the future? As we stand on the peak of Newman's Ridge one last time, we will look out over the horizon and see the final truth of the forbidden blood. It is a truth that goes beyond one tribe or one mountain. It is a truth about the human spirit itself. Join us for the final conclusion of the Melungeon enigma. The blood never forgets, and the conclusion will stay with you forever. The mist is finally gone. As the first light of a new morning breaks over the jagged limestone of Newman's Ridge, the shadows that have hidden the Melungeons for 300 years have nowhere left to hide. We have traveled from the storm-tossed decks of Portuguese galleons to the silent ruins of the lost colony. We have walked the halls of the Ottoman Sultan's palace and sat by the defiant hearth of Mahala Mullins. We have peered into the double helix of the DNA and heard the haunting wail of the mountain fiddle. And now, at the end of this long, winding trail, we find ourselves standing face to face with the ultimate truth of the forbidden blood. It is a truth that is much bigger than one group of people on a ridge in Tennessee. It is the truth of who we are as a human family. If this journey has changed the way you see history and yourself, please subscribe and share this final chapter with the world. We have spent 15 parts uncovering the secret of the Melungeons, and your presence here is the final piece of the puzzle. Let us know in the comments, what secret does your own blood carry? Now, let us find the peace that was denied to the ancestors for so long. The story of the Melungeons was once a story of exclusion. It was a tale of people who were told they didn't belong, that their skin was too dark, their eyes too light, and their history too messy for the neat boxes of the world. But as we look back on everything we have uncovered, we see that the very things the world rejected were the things that made the Melungeons indestructible. Their mixed blood was not a weakness. It was an extraordinary library of human survival. They were the pioneers of a globalized world, carrying the resilience of Africa, the wisdom of the East, and the spirit of the frontier in every heartbeat. They proved that borders are nothing more than lines drawn in the dirt, while the blood is a river that flows through every valley and over every ridge, connecting us all. We must ask ourselves, what does it mean to be pure? For centuries, the law used that word as a weapon, but the Melungeons show us that there is no such thing as a pure history. We are all mosaics. We are all the descendants of shipwrecks, migrations, and secret alliances. To be Melungeon is to be the living proof that outcasts can build a fortress that the world cannot break. It is the realization that being forbidden was actually a way of being sacred. They were kept apart so that their story could be preserved for a time when the world was finally ready to understand it. That time is now. Think of the children of Newman's Ridge who were once taught to be ashamed of their names. Today, those names, Collins, Mullins, Goins, Gibson, are badges of honor. They are the names of people who refused to vanish. They are the names of families who chose the rocky soil of the ridges over the easy lies of the valleys. The forbidden blood has become the honored lineage. The blue people have become the global pioneers. The transformation is complete. The mystery is not a burden anymore. It is a legacy. It is a reminder that no matter how hard the world tries to erase you, your blood will never forget who you are. But the lesson of the Melungeons goes even deeper. It challenges us to look into our own mirrors and ask, whose ghosts are we carrying? We all have a Newman's Ridge in our family tree, a place where the records stop, where the stories turn into whispers, and where the forbidden begins. The Melungeons give us the courage to climb those ridges and look for the truth. They teach us that our identity is not something given to us by a census taker or a judge. It is something we claim for ourselves. It is a choice to embrace every part of our heritage, no matter how complex or controversial it may be. As we descend from the mountains for the last time, we leave behind the ghosts of the night walkers and the fear of the evil eye. We replace them with the reality of a people who have finally come home. The Melungeons are no longer a lost tribe. They are a found people. They are the heartbeat of Appalachia and the soul of a new, diverse America. The mist will return to the ridge, as it always does, but it will never again be able to hide the faces of those who live there. The silence of the centuries has been broken by the roar of 1,000 voices reclaiming their name. The blood never forgets. It remembers the salt of the Mediterranean. It remembers the heat of the African sun. It remembers the cold of the English winter and the beauty of the Cherokee forest. And most of all, it remembers the strength it took to survive in the shadows for 300 years. The story of the Melungeons is the story of humanity itself, a story of wandering, of mixing, of suffering, and of ultimate glorious triumph. We are all pieces of a larger puzzle, and the forbidden blood is the thread that weaves us all together into one magnificent tapestry. Thank you for walking this ridge with us. Thank you for listening to the whispers in the wind and the secrets in the DNA. The journey of the Melungeons is your journey too. As you move forward, remember the queen on the ridge, the sailors in the galleons, and the children with the glass eyes, remember that you are the result of 1,000 miracles and 1,000,000 miles of travel. Your blood is a sacred record of the world's history. Treasure it, protect it, and never, ever let anyone tell you that you are anything less than a masterpiece of human survival. The ridge is quiet now. The music of the fiddle has faded into the trees, but the story remains. It is written in the stones of the cabins, the soil of the hollows, and the souls of the people. The forbidden blood is finally free. And as we close this chapter of the Melungeon enigma, we do so with the knowledge that the greatest mysteries are not the ones we solve, but the ones we live. Go forth with the pride of the mountains in your heart and the wisdom of the ancient sea in your eyes. The world is waiting for your story. Goodbye from the high peaks of Newman's Ridge. The blood never forgets. And now, neither will you.